firstly, Dave, thank you so much for coming to the Arcade Attack podcast. We do really appreciate it. Before we get into your time at Lucasfilm Games, I'd love to know how you first got into computers, what was your first work experiences, and how ultimately you got to work at one of the best and most famous companies in the world, really.
Sure. Well, my first experience with computers probably when I was in high school, and I got to take a class at the local junior college.
Yeah.
It's like a 2-year college. So after lunch, I would drive over to the college and take a class, and it was actually kind of interesting, but also really frustrating because this was in the era before microcomputers, and we were using punch cards.
All right.
So you have to sit write out your program on paper first, and then type it in, one line of code per card. You bring it over to the computer guru guy who fed them in, put them in the stack, and then next day you come back and find out whether there were any syntax errors. If there were, you replace the cards with new ones with correction, and then you come back the next day to find out whether your program ran. Wow. So it was basically a 24-hour turnaround between each change you made. And I was just not very exacting and precise with my code, and just found it more frustrating than anything. And so, okay, well, I'm not going to screw this. I'm not going to be a computer scientist. I think I took one other class after that when I was at college, when I went to the 4-year college at UCLA, and had a very similar experience, except they were using paper tape, which is probably even more frustrating than cards, because you have to make an error, you have to rerun the whole tape through the machine to get to the point where you have to type the fix. So I kind of gave up on that and ended up going into psychology. And
wow.
during a field trip, we ended up going to Stanford Research Institute, and I saw my first real computer game on a CRT. It was the Space Wars game, where you have a couple of triangles flying around, moving around a screen, and you push a key and you fire out little period dots, and there no sound, no color, just all basically character graphics moving around on a screen. But it just something clicked, and I said, wow, this is just really, really cool. And it took a few years to get back to that, but that just felt like that was going to be something important for me. My wife and I ended up creating a public access microcomputer center here in Marin County, and this was in 1977 we opened. Wow. And this is right at the beginning of microcomputers. Apple II had just come out. Radio Shack computer, the TRS-80, was about to come out, and we ended up with getting a bunch of these processor technology Sol 20s, and people would come in and rent time on our computers for $1.50 an hour, and we'd teach programming classes, and we'd enter in programs from the magazines in BASIC and make little changes to them. And then we eventually, I learned programming by doing this, and also by taking code from other programs and modifying it and learning how other people wrote programs. And there's a company called Adventure International that was doing small adventure games, kind of in text adventures, in the vein of the big one, the Adventure Cave one.
Yes, yeah.
But his were on different topics. He had a pirate one, he had different ones, and he wrote them for the Radio Shack computer in Radio Shack's BASIC, and we did a deal with him where we would convert them to the Apple II and then get a small royalty for doing that. And again, that's another place where I got to look at someone else's code and adventure games specifically.
Wow.
And this would have been probably maybe 1978, 79. And, I really liked that whole type of game a lot. And so it was kind of a precursor. And because we had the center, we had members from all over the place, including one guy from Industrial Light and Magic. our ILM, who told me about this new games group that was about to open or start up at Lucasfilm. And I immediately contacted them and was able to get in and interview and got the job, one of the first jobs there. I think I was the third person.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. And I actually had one piece I left out was right before, a year earlier. I was working on a computer animation book called Computer Animation Primer, which featured the combination of the Atari 800 coding, and the first part was more an overview of the state of the art of computer animation. And during the research stage, I was able to talk to the people at the Lucasfilm Computer Division and go there and see examples of their work and meet a bunch of them and hang out with them at the SIGGRAPH conference. And so I already had a relationship with some of them. So when I heard about this new group opening up, I had already met Ed Catmull, who is the head of the computer division.
Yeah.
And, so I called him directly, and he's the one who put me in touch with the guy they had just hired named Peter Langston, who became our first general manager. And in fact, Atari was helping to fund the startup of this new games group.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think they gave like $1 million to Lucasfilm in order to get the first right of any game that we produced. They get to first choice of them, right of first refusal. And so I had my manuscript of my Atari book in my hand, and that combined with having met the people and a bunch of other things, just, if I had looked back and said, okay, what are the steps I need to do to get that job? And gone through all those steps, I don't think I could have done any better than what I did. So that was kind of, magical in a way. And once I got there, it took me, a year or two to stop pinching myself and saying, is this really happening? How could I be here? Do I really belong? Am I good enough? I mean, here are these brilliant computer scientists in the same division that we're in our parent division and the computer division. This is the group that eventually got bought by Steve Jobs to become Pixar. And I'm looking at these guys with their background. I'm looking at me with my background, like self-taught programmer who only really knew BASIC.
Wow.
And it's like, how am I going to make this happen? So it worked, and I was there for about 10 years.
That's a fair play and fair. You sound very humble, but your resume obviously shows that you did belong there. Well, that's my opinion anyway. I'm sure.
Well, thank you. But you have to look at the other part of it. Like there were probably millions of people who were technically more qualified than I was. But I happened to live in Marin County and happened to have started this computer center and written this book and met someone who told me about this at the right time. And so all these like kind of randomly kind of synchronicity things happening, which
the stars aligned, didn't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, fair play. How about the interview itself? Did you actually get interviewed by George Lucas? Did you see much of George, or not really?
No, well, definitely not by George. I think I might have only been interviewed by Peter.
Yeah.
And I did get to meet George maybe almost a year after I started, when we had early versions of our first two games working. Mine was, there was what ended up being Rescue on Fractalus.
Yeah.
And he came in for a demo and actually, was in my office and handed him the joystick, and he played the game for a while, and then we talked, and he gave me some really good feedback, which essentially transformed the game. And that was the only real direct experience, like one-on-one experience I had with him.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah.
Other times I'd meet him and say hello, or I remember right before we did Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, we had a short meeting with, by we I mean myself, Ron Gilbert, and Noah Falstein.
Yeah.
And then with George and Steven Spielberg, met kind of casually and just asked questions about, how close we had to stay to the script, and could we kill Indy if we wanted to, and could we go off into tangents, and they basically gave us total freedom to do what we wanted to, and they really didn't come back and check. So there really wasn't much oversight. I guess they trusted us or knew that we'd, do well enough that they didn't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I've got a question a little bit later actually about that, but brilliant. That sounds like they put a lot of trust in you. Fair play.
Yeah.
Obviously, you started very early in LucasFilm Games, later to become LucasArts, obviously. Could you sort of describe these early days? Obviously, I assume it's quite a small office back in the real early days, and who are the real key people back then that you really worked closely with in the real sort of first couple of years, maybe?
Well, first few years, I think by the end of the first couple of years, we might have been up to maybe 10 or 15 people in the group. Obviously, Peter Langston was our general manager, so I got to work with him a lot. And his background was much more from research, which I think was one of the reasons they brought him in, because initially I don't know if it was clear that we were going to be a production company as opposed to maybe just researching how can we bring the aesthetic of Lucasfilm into games, into interactive. And at some point that shifted, I think maybe soon after we actually released the first two games. Then became clear, like, hey, we can actually build product that ships, and we should no longer be focused on being a research group. We should really be focused on production. And around that time, became clear that Peter wasn't going to be the best match for that, since he was much more of a research guy. So we brought in Steve Arnold, who ended up being our general manager for most of the time I was there. And his background, he was actually a psychologist, which really helped to manage a bunch of crazy games people. He was like the dad of the group.
And obviously you studied psychology, you said earlier, so I suppose you had that in common.
It's something in common, but I really wasn't a practicing psychologist. So the difference. He had actually, I think his previous gig, though, was working at Atari, getting a whole bunch of games at 50 or 60 games out the door, mostly conversions and adaptations. But he was clearly able to get product out. So clearly those two guys, Dave Levine and I shared an office. Dave Levine did Wallblazer. He and I shared an office for a little bit, and then we were there. I mean, he basically was hired a month after I was. So we were there around the same time, but we never actually worked on a project together. And, we give feedback back and forth, but he was more off doing his thing on his own. Lauren Carpenter, who was my initial office mate, was actually a brilliant guy behind animating fractals. And he was in the computer division, and he was on loan to us off and on during the first 6 months to get Rescue on Fractals working.
Okay.
And, Charlie Kilner, someone who was, I think, Apple employee number 7, was someone I met when I was at the computer center. And I asked him to interview for a position. He was like probably the best 6502 programmer I knew. It's brilliant, knew ins and outs of that chip, and all the games we were doing initially were 6502 based, and we were doing it in assembly language. Actually, we were using a Lisp cross assembler that another guy who was with us for a short period wrote for us to use, because we actually used a VAX computer to compile all of our code, and then we had a way to download it directly to either through the Atari or to the target machine.
Oh, nice.
So we were doing development on larger computers, and then using our target machines. It wasn't until years later when PCs were powerful enough that we could just develop directly on the PC.
Yeah, sounds like a very different sort of time back then. Very difficult to to manage,
Yeah.
but fair play. Fair play.
Another guy was Noah Falstein, who was he really wasn't on the first two projects. He came on like soon after, probably towards the end of production on our projects. I know he was in the manual photographs that we took for Rescue. And he was, he's still a really good friend of mine. We actually saw him yesterday. So he's one of the few people I see on a pretty regular basis. We have a tradition where if we get sidetracked in other things, we have these birthday lunches. Our birthdays are about 6 months apart. So if we miss other dates, we at least get to see each other once a year or twice a year for a lunch on each of our birthdays.
Oh, good on you. Isn't he the person that came up with the freeway system on Atlantis as well? The free options, the free sort of pathways. Is that right?
I'm not sure. I was actually out of the company by the time we were working on that game.
Okay, fair enough.
Or it was mostly out. But I think the only game I really worked with him on was the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Brilliant game.
So so he was the original project leader, and then when we realized we had to get the game out the door in time for the film, and Ron and I got brought onto the project. We all worked together, pretty much co-project leaders and coders.
Brilliant.
So I'm probably leaving out some important people. I mean, there was a really awesome team early on, and we all, I think we started a tradition which carried on for a long time, where when someone new was going to be brought on, we would all have a chance to interview with that person and, give our feedback, a thumbs up, thumbs down. Do we think the person would fit? And, the final decision would be that of the general manager.
Of course.
But it felt like an exclusive club. Like, do we want this person in our club? And that probably ended up creating some pushback by some people who we interviewed, but we didn't hire for whatever reason. But that was, it also created a really close group of maybe people that thought too much alike. I don't know. I think we really honored, wackiness and craziness, at least definitely later on. That was something we were looking for when we were looking for additional programmers to help with games.
Oh, well, I mean, fair play. I mean, so many great games that have come out from the studio, let's be honest. Was Rescue on Fractious the first ever game you worked on, David? Was there any others before that, or?
Well, definitely the first Lucas game.
Yeah.
There was a really small game I did under contract for Children's Television Workshop in a Sesame Street company.
Oh, wow.
When we were at the computer center, they came and visited us because they were about to create this new center in Philadelphia called Sesame Place, and they wanted a bunch of Apple II games that they could put in consoles or in kiosks and let kids play, really short games that would last a couple minutes to 5 minutes each. And we did one for them called Mix and Match Muppets. And I did the design and actually did the artwork by using a graphics tablet and scanning in drawings from Sesame Street coloring books. And I didn't write the assembly code. Had another guy help with that, but I wrote the rest of the code that ran the program. It's really written in BASIC.
Yeah.
You could search for it and find like a picture. Basically, you're a really simple game for young kids where you choose the head, body, and feet from different Sesame Street Muppets, and it combines them together into a new one.
That sounds pretty good.
Gives them a name, and it's kind of funny.
Yeah. Yeah, genetically modified Muppets. That sounds good.
Yeah. That's the extent. I mean, it wasn't a very deep game.
But it paved the way. Obviously, it gave you that sort of early ideas, I suppose, and early sort of practice. Brilliant.
Yeah, well, also knowing that I could do one from start to finish helped.
Of course, yeah. Fair play. Rescue on Fractious obviously is quite different to sort of future Lucasfilm and LucasArts games. How do you reflect back on the game looking back now? I mean, you were the project leader, weren't you? Was it the overall designer as well? Is that right?
Yeah, project leader, designer, one of the programmers. I don't think at the time I started doing it, I basically didn't. I don't think I had the word. We didn't have the word project leader yet. So it took me maybe 6 months into the game before I realized that this was actually my game. That I was in charge.
Yeah,
it's kind of weird. But it started because I shared an office with Lauren Carpenter for a few months until our own space was ready. And being the fractal guy, he did the fractal fly-through sequence in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where they're terraforming this planet, the Genesis Effect planet. And so he knew how to do fractals where you're flying through, but that, doing a thing where you're taking 1 or 2 days to render each frame of a beautiful scene is really different than having to get it to run at a reasonable frame rate on a 6502 computer.
Yeah.
So I asked him early on, is there any way that we could do a fractal, first-person fractal game on an Atari 800? And he kind of laughed and said, no way. And then he said, a little while later, he said, well, maybe there is a way to do it. And we ended up loaning him a computer, and came back within maybe a day or two with a working prototype of fractal scene that you could fly around in, or at least move around in. And so that was the idea for the game. Was I wanted something which was kind of like a Star Wars experience. I joined the company because I wanted to be inside Star Wars in some way. And the best way could be to do an authentic Star Wars game within the company, and where you're flying like an X-Wing or something. And through a fractal landscape. That was the original idea. And then we found out that we weren't allowed to do any Star Wars games.
It's a shame, isn't it?
No. Well, yes and no. It was a shame because that's why I thought I joined the company. At the time, I was really upset.
Yeah.
And it's because the license to everything Star Wars had already been sold to other companies, exclusive licenses for big bucks. So the plus side is that meant that we had to be creative outside of Star Wars. We couldn't use that as a crutch. And that also meant that I think George gave us much more creative freedom because we weren't delving in his universe, in his baby. So you didn't have to worry about us messing it up. So by having that, it was actually probably a huge blessing because we had at least maybe 9 years that we were essentially Star Wars free and could come up with our own cool ideas. So on Rescue, once we saw it was doable, then we had a small team where we were doing the whole game, and I did the design. I did a lot of the gameplay related code, where all the heavy lifting in terms of fractal stuff and the character animation and sound routines were done either by Lauren for the flying part, and then Charlie Kellner did most of the rest of the really involved stuff that had to be optimized for 6502.
Okay.
And I kind of did the glue, I guess. Where the scoring and the how the art would look for the firing of the missiles and the level of difficulties and the opening sequences, like in the tube and flying out into the planet's surface, and all the the way the gameplay worked. So it worked really well. So I think we had a really good team, and we realized we had a great game coming out. It was really a huge blow to us when the games, both Rescue and Ballblazer, ended up on the pirate networks, on the bulletin boards, before we shipped the games. And the games actually didn't ship for like another year past that for weird combination of sequence of things events that happen. And so by the time it came out for that platform, anyone who actually wanted it could have easily have downloaded a copy.
So it's a shame, isn't it? All that hard work, just...
Yeah. Definitely it affected how I looked at piracy. I think we were totally naive because we lent out copies of the games to Atari for the marketing department, and like a week after is when they were on the bulletin boards. So we don't know if that's how they got out.
Yeah,
seems likely.
That is a shame. That is a shame.
Yeah, we didn't do any kind of serialization. We didn't put any kind of copy protection on. So who knows?
Fair enough. You then moved on. Is it fair to say that I think Labyrinth was your next game?
Right.
Was that your first graphic adventure? And was it very different working on a sort of game like Labyrinth compared to your previous sort of first, the shooting sort of games and so forth?
Yeah, it was also the first game we did that was based on a film.
Yeah, of course.
And I think they were kind of testing us to see whether we could actually take a film and adapt it into a game. And they gave us the opportunity. We saw some early footage on a videotape
with David Bowie dancing around and so forth.
Yeah, showing them the puppets, the Muppets, and some of the story. We got a script to look at, and they said, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And I said, "Sure." Sounds like it'd be kind of fun to do it. So we ended up. A group of us went to England and had a week there where we were brainstorming with Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide. Yeah. And he was good friends with, he was really good friends with Jim Henson, who was the director on the film. And we ended up in a room like pretty much every day for a week, 5 days. And going through the script and talking about how we could adapt that. And he came up with some really great ideas, many of which made it into the game. And then it was my job when we came back to take all the brainstorming ideas and figure out how to adapt them into a cohesive game that also, honored the film, but didn't require that you saw the film.
That's a tough balancing act, isn't it? Yeah, it's a tough balancing act.
Yeah. We didn't want having seen the film to be a huge advantage. So we try to create a parallel story inside of the same universe with some of the same obstacles, and you had to come up with ways to go around them. The fact that we knew it was going to be a graphics game, we originally thought it would be closer to a Sierra Online game with a text parser.
Oh, okay.
And realized that in order to compete, it would take us way too long to come up with a really good text parser that, or even good enough, that was on the level of the Sierra ones. We just didn't have the time for the iterations and the research and to come up with that. So we came up with the idea of this kind of a slot machine interface where you have two vertical scrolling wheels.
Word wheels text system, isn't it? It's really quite impressive.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's functions similarly to what we did later with the Scum games.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say did that lay the groundwork for the Scum engine? Do you think? I
don't know how much it did. I mean, clearly Ron was already there at the time.
Yeah.
He didn't work on that game, but he was in the room, or rooms close enough to see it. And I think he might have just realized that he liked the idea. I actually don't know. I mean, he might have seen that this was a good solution. He already didn't like parsers, so he wanted another solution. I think ours was probably, I think his is way more elegant than what we came up with. But there had to be some connection. I mean, he definitely used some of the code for the sprites and the scrolling and a lot of the stuff that Charlie had done.
Yeah.
The technical part got brought into the Scum engine, cell animation, probably the sound engines that Charlie had put together. I'm not sure what else, but a lot of that made it in. So we tended to reuse whatever we could. Going back to Labyrinth, the idea of starting out with essentially a text adventure for the first 5 minutes was one of Douglas Adams' ideas. He had the idea that maybe you're being introduced in the world kind of like the way that you get introduced into Oz in the Wizard of Oz film.
Yeah.
Where first it's in black and white and then it's in full color once you get to that new world. And we figure, okay, well, black and white equivalent would be like a text adventure. And so you have to go around, the real world, finding a couple objects you need to make it into this movie theater, which then is where you get sucked into the film, essentially. And you're in the world of the Labyrinth. And then it's full color and a graphic adventure. So the downside was we were afraid that some people would think they were getting a graphics adventure, well, they were, but start playing with the text adventure part and say, "Hey, this is not what I bought," and give up and then to return it or something. So the movie didn't do all that well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think famously the game actually sold better than the movie. I think when it initially came out, is that fair? Or?
Possibly, yeah. But I think also because the movie didn't do especially well. Activision, who was the company that actually published and funded it, I don't think they put a lot of marketing into it because they saw that the film wasn't going to, help carry it. The film didn't carry the game.
Shame,
of course, now
film's
now classic in that it's David Bowie movie, and
I'm a huge fan actually of Labyrinth. I showed my wife recently. I think it's very, very. It hasn't aged too badly at all.
That's cool. Yeah, I haven't seen it for years. So, Jennifer Connelly, who went on to do a bunch of amazing stuff, and seeing her as a 16-year-old, and there's some fun stuff in it. It's just kind of crazy.
Maybe ahead of its time slightly, you could argue, possibly.
I think, yeah. It was also kind of, it was a difficult game in a lot of ways because we also had a hard deadline.
Yeah.
Where we didn't have that with our other games, and here we had a release date for the film that wasn't going to move, and we didn't actually get the game out to coincide with the release. I think it came out a couple months after.
Right.
Which is not ideal because we couldn't then really piggyback off of all the marketing that the film was going to get.
Did you have to do quite a few long nights then to try and meet the deadline as much as possible?
Yeah, there's a huge crunch period that summer to try to get it out.
Well, fair play. Obviously, I know Lucasfilm and LucasArts, that they make more than just text adventures and point-and-click adventures. But obviously, you may disagree slightly, but I think that was their forte, around this sort of period of time, just leading up to Maniac Mansion, for example. Was there a particular point in the office when focus really shifted to that sort of genre, or was it just an organic change, or was there a big meeting, or do you think I'm not even, is that not really a fair question in a sense, or?
Well, I think there were always other projects happening. Yeah. There was at some point it became clear there was like a graphic adventure contingent or group.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also had Larry Holland was working on a bunch of flight simulator type games. And so there was a whole other area where we were doing simulators, essentially. Noah's Cronus Rift was much more of a strategy type game, with an action element. He was basically using the fractal code from Rescue.
Right.
Brought up to a new level. And then there was, he did a PHM Pegasus, which was a kind of a game with a hovercraft that you're in. I think it was. Is it hovercraft?
Yeah, I'd take it for it. Well, yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah,
so it's not.
And so he ended up working with Larry on the flight simulator stuff that Larry would do to some degree. And I think we always had that other arm, which eventually moved over to, from like World War II type simulations, like Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
And then on to, Star Wars.
That was a huge arm later on, wasn't it?
Right. And it was, Larry's group did a lot of the early Star Wars flight simulator stuff.
Yeah.
So that was a whole other section. But I was always really focused on adventures. The only game I did that really wasn't an adventure game was the first one, was Rescue.
Yeah.
And once it makes sense looking back that was the game that I was drawn to before I even came to Lucas. It makes sense that where I'd end up working on those. But I don't remember any kind of here's what we have to do. I mean, I remember brainstorming on other game ideas that never made it to games. I think we were looking for outside funding for some, which really weren't especially graphic adventures.
Yeah.
So, other types of games I was still interested in, but that was what, that's the path I went on, I guess.
Oh, fair enough. Obviously, Maniac Mansion, huge game. It sort of led on to like Day of the Tentacle and so forth. And one of my personal favourites, really old classic game in my view. What was it like working with Ron Gilbert and obviously Gary Winnick? I mean, legends in their field. Obviously, you were involved in the game as well. What was that like? And can you describe like a typical day working on that game, for example?
Yeah, well, Ron, I guess I was between projects. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, and I knew Ron had been working on something for like a year already, and he had finally gotten to the point where he had enough of the Scum engine working that he could actually start coding the game.
Yep.
And realized that he still had to continue working on the engine, but he wanted the game to start. So he asked me if I'd be interested in putting in a couple months of Scum coding to help him with that game. So I came on, and I didn't know anything about the project or the story, because Gary had pretty much come up with that. They had it laid out, but not on a really finely detailed level.
Yeah.
So they had most of the puzzles, but most of the rooms defined, but not any of the dialogue or the actual, how you actually went about interacting with the different characters. So I started doing that, and kind of interesting to work in an engine that's still very buggy. So
yep.
I couldn't really tell initially whether it was my bug or his bug, and we have to try to put all the time into trying narrowing out what the issues are. But it was very clear that this was his game and Gary's game, and I had no problem, letting them run with, do that, take creative control.
Yep.
And I think we worked really well together. I felt very comfortable on the team. Our offices were close to each other, so I'd be popping into his office all the time saying, okay, in this section, what happens if you do this, this, and this? And I said, oh, we never thought of that. And, we just brainstorm on the moment, come up with a solution. I go back and code it up, and then, as each room came up, we talked about what had to happen there, what the interactions were. It worked smoothly. I mean, what turned out to be what he thought was going to be 2 months to code the whole game turned out to be, I think I was on for about 6 months.
Wow.
And it still wasn't done. He had to go on to something else, but he ended up having to put a lot more time because of the complexity of having all the multiple choices of kids and multiple endings you could have. Mm. So it was much more complex. I think that made the game enormously more complex than it would have been if he had just here's 3 people you run through the game with. But it also gave it a lot more replayability, and you could try any combination of kids and find a way to complete it, with different solutions.
Oh, fair play. Is it true that it was the first ever self-published game by Lucasfilm at the time?
Yes. Yeah. I think at that point we realized that that's where we had to go from having other companies publish our games to actually doing them ourselves. Does that
add extra pressure at all, maybe, to make it... I know that Ron's obviously a proper legend, but to make the games perfect before it's released, obviously...
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think everything we did, we had that same level of knowing that we had to live up to Star Wars. Like everything we turned out, this is people would think of us as the Star Wars of computer games or something. So we felt like it wasn't even a mandate. It was just something we felt internal pressure that we had to live up to that expectation. In fact, going back to the first 2 games, that pressure was so high that in order to not feel frozen by that, we were told that the first 2 games we attempted would just be throwaway games, that we would do these as an experiment, as a research project, kind of get our feet wet to see what it would feel like to take a game all the way through. And if they turned out to be interesting games, then sure, we could publish them, but otherwise don't worry about it. So that took a whole bunch of pressure off that, we were given permission to fail. Right at the beginning. And then when we realized that we weren't failing, that it was actually pretty good, then,
fair
that
play.
changed.
Just shows you how well the team was working at the time, and still, and so many great games were published. Zak McKracken and the Alien Mindbenders, that was another project you led. How would that rank in your personal favourites of all the games you've worked on? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but you put a lot of time and energy into that game, I believe. And would you ever like to make an official sequel to the game? Would that be something that ever crossed your mind?
Okay, well, first, it's probably, at least up until recently, probably was my favorite. It was really the only graphic adventure I worked on that totally came from myself.
Yep.
Because of the other 2 I worked on, Maniac was really Ron and Gary's universe that I was playing inside of and trying to, adapt my humor to what they were creating. Mm-hmm. And then following that was Indiana Jones. And again, we were on a film project, so we had some limited control over where we were going. The story was already established.
Same with Labyrinth, I suppose, a little bit.
Yeah, same with Labyrinth. So really, that was the first game I did. That was a graphic adventure where the story was completely mine, and the whole type of game was came out of my interest in kind of new agey kinds of things, and early on, after I had the design completed, we had a meeting with the other game designers of the company, of the group, and that one that Ron had actually instigated, because he felt that the game was, well, could it be funny? It could be a lot funnier. That we should take it into a much more wacky direction than I originally had. I mean, it was intended as a comedy originally, but it was more buttoned down.
Yeah.
The character, his name was Jason. He worked for mainstream media. He wasn't working for like this little tabloid, and all the rooms or locations and everything were the same. That didn't change, but we kind of twisted it a little bit by making into Wacky Land, by coming up with this title. That's where the title was born. That's where the Zak got his name. Came out of a phone book, Marin County phone book. I think we had to combine a couple of different names.
Yeah.
And the idea of working for a tabloid came from that. And so with that shift, it felt like things that were clicking a lot better. And then we went off and started coding. And I got some help early on too. I realized I wasn't going to be able to do the whole thing myself, and so Matthew Kane, who's already working with us in the education group, the learning group, came over to help me with all the coding. So at that point, the game became a really a collaborative experience, and it was probably one of the best gaming experiences too, in terms of working with him and building this universe together and just having a lot of fun with it. So yeah, I have a lot of fond memories on that. I've been asked a lot whether I would want to do a sequel, and it changes from time to time. I mean, I know that Disney owns everything at this point, and the idea of even doing a reboot seems pretty unlikely. You'd have to. I mean, they wouldn't even talk to someone like us. You'd have to be like what Double Fine did, where essentially Sony got the license and then Double Fine did the work to do those. We did talk about this, some years ago as a possibility, but I think, especially after doing Thimbleweed Park, the idea of doing new stuff is just much more fun to me right now than kind of going back and revisiting something old, even though I'm really fond of the characters and the whole story.
Of course, yeah.
So I'm open to it, but I'm not actively pursuing it. So if things kind of happened like that, then I wouldn't say no straight out.
Yeah, but a lot of things would need to be put in place, wouldn't they, I suppose?
Yeah, I don't think I'm in a place where I say, okay, I'm going to go get that license. I'm going to make it happen right now. I don't feel that kind of a drive. Yeah. But if it kind of things fell in my lap and that's what was happening, then there'd be interest.
Because I think a few fans made their own sort of games, didn't they? Have you heard about these? Their own sort of spin-off?
Yeah.
Have you played any of those, by any chance? Or?
I didn't, because I think at the time I felt that if there ever was a sequel, I didn't want to have played theirs for fear of accidentally pulling ideas from their games into a sequel.
Yeah. But you weren't upset by them making games, was that?
No, I felt honored.
Yeah, of course.
It felt like, wow, this is amazing. I had no idea that people, and they're all from Germany. The German fans loved the game so much that they had to create the universe to continue playing in it. So yeah, no, I'm totally honored. I was in touch with a few of them. I think on one of the games, Matthew, myself, and my wife Annie got together and recorded some audio snippets for them, and that got put into the game.
Good on you.
So I was supportive in a way, but not involved.
Yeah, fair play to you. I think that's a very good attitude. Brilliant.
Yeah.
I think you kind of answered this question already. But obviously, George Lucas, huge films. It was pretty much a no-brainer to start making adventure titles using his sort of licenses. And obviously, The Last Crusade, I think, was one of the first ones at least. Did you have to work really, really closely to the script of the film, or were you given quite a lot of creative freedom? I know you kind of mentioned it earlier, but did you see the film before you made the game, or was it a bit like Labyrinth, or how was that working in that particular game?
No, well, it was similar to Labyrinth in that we got a script and we got projection stills that we got to look at, so we knew what the locales would look like. There was the library at the ranch. We were at the ranch at the time. The library had all the slides, the film images that were taken during production, where they kind of maybe they're partly continuity images, or they were maybe going to be used for promotion later on for PR. But we got to access those, so we knew how to make the game look like the environments that they took place in. But the movie really wasn't done. I mean, and here we were again trying to get a film and game to release at the same time.
Yeah.
So there was no way we could watch the movie before, because the movie really wasn't finished until a few weeks before it released. We did get to go down to Los Angeles to Paramount Studios, and we had a screening with a bunch of other people. Like, it's a first-time screening.
Yeah.
And that was our first experience with the whole film. And during watching that, that probably wasn't even the final cut. That was like maybe pretty close to final. I think there might have been a few scenes that were Let me think. I think there might have been a screening we saw before that up at the ranch also. Because I remember there were some scenes that said, missing or special effects or things that weren't quite complete. But that was, we were far into the game and, couldn't have changed much at that point. There were a couple of scenes that we got from the script that never made it to the movie. There's a whole sequence on the Zeppelin with a radio operator, which was much more involved in the original script. So it had more of a role in the game. But I think our idea of, similar to Labyrinth, how do we use the environment? And here you are, Indy, so you really are going through the same story flow. But how do we make it so it feels really interesting for someone who's actually seen the movie? And came up with the idea of that you could use often 3 different ways to solve some of the puzzles, either by fighting your way through. So we had this whole fighting, boxing interaction, and you could take on the Nazi guards or whatever.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, or you do it through dialogue puzzles where you could talk your way through, or you could do it by finding the right object that person needed at that time to let you through. And we tracked all that so we knew, through multiple playthroughs, which of these solutions you've used, and kept a running total and gave you indie points based on which of all the different solutions you've tried. So the only way to get the maximum number of points would have been to play through, several times in order to get them all. And I think that gave some replayability and made it, much more of a, expandability in terms of the game.
Of course, yeah.
But it was a tight project also. I mean, I remember it being a lot of attention, stress, but not, I don't remember the team suffering as a result. It felt like we were putting in long hours, but I still remember that as a fun project to have worked on.
Is it weird watching the film now? as I assume you're a fan of the films. Is it weird looking back?
Yeah, well, I haven't seen it for a long time. I would like to watch it again. But I loved the movie when it came out. I did not care for the number 2, the Temple of Doom, very much.
Yeah.
And so seeing this felt like we were back in real indie land, and the whole thing with his father was just a huge amount of fun.
Well, Sean Connery is very good in that one. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Doesn't have to be your own title. It can be your own title. But do you have a personal favourite Lucasfilm or LucasArts game that you ever saw or worked on, or just?
Probably the first 2 Monkey Island games.
Yeah, they're my favourite. Up there are my favourites, definitely.
Yeah. I didn't work. I mean, I at the time of the first one, I was then the director of operations, so I wasn't actually doing game design, but I did get to participate in the brainstorming meetings and threw out some ideas. At least one of them got into the game, and there's, I just remember there more as a support person for Ron, and I was more in charge of resource management essentially at the time. So I'm credited in the game, but not from actually doing the game.
It's my first ever adventure game I ever played, and it's definitely got a special place in my heart. It's just so well done, isn't it? I have to say.
Yeah, I think it was brilliant.
When did you actually leave LucasArts, and how would you reflect back at your time working there? I think you were there for about 10 years. Is that right, David? So how would
well, I was with Lucasfilm for 10 years.
Yeah.
The first 8 years I was in LucasFilm Games / LucasArts, and when I actually came to the company, my real interest, and I didn't say this before, but when I was the impetus for actually starting our computer center. It was back in 1975 or 76. We were brainstorming, and I was imagining some sort of, futuristic, interactive Disneyland. So rather than just sitting at a computer and playing a game, you'd be fully immersed in an experience, and it would be, it would change every time you did it, and it would be life changing. Having gone through these would change you in a way, in a good way. Just with having really solid transformative experiences while going through these. And that was kind of the goal. It originally was to work on an interactive Disneyland.
How amazing is that?
Yeah. So, and this is before, virtual reality and any of that terminology came up. And so when I first joined, I said, here's what I want to do. And I told that to Peter and I told that to Steve Arnold, and they said, well, that's great. Right now we're doing home games. So that was kind of what I got to do in the meantime. But Steve said, if he actually was really interested in that whole idea too. And he said, well, let's do this now and maybe we'll get to do that later. So when he asked me to be director of operations, it was kind of like, he knew that wasn't really what I wanted to be doing. He said, just, help me out for a year. And at the end of that, you get everything set up. We'll get someone in to take your place at that. And then we'll do this, try to do a location-based entertainment project. And you can be on that. So that's pretty much what happened. So at the end of my director of operations year, we had started up a new little group. It was pretty much outside of LucasArts. It was a separate division called Rebel Arts and Technology, and called RAT. And it was just a very kind of skunkworks type group where we had a venture with Hughes Simulation. Hughes was the company that was doing a lot of the flight simulators for military and for commercial airlines. Yep. And we decided we would do a kind of a flight simulator based on, LucasFilm properties. So the first game, so I got to do a Star Wars game in this, in a flight simulator, a real flight simulator, essentially. Wow. And the idea would be that we would create these. Lucas would be in charge of our team would be in charge of the creative part of it. Doing the story, doing the sound effects, and designing the look of the pod itself. And Hughes would be in charge of the tech, coming up with the right computers and the right projectors and all the technical stuff. They already knew how to do that. So that was 2 years. I was on that for 2 years, and amazing games. This is way before its time. I mean, now you could do stuff like this much more easily, but at the time we had to use like $1 million image generators and super expensive for the whole thing. And in fact, it was so expensive that at the time we couldn't practically get it sold into theme parks. So the project closed down, and I left. I left the company as a result, because I at the time I really wanted to be doing something either in VR. That VR by then had been at least early versions had been invented. I got to play with it and said, this is what I want to do. And the idea of going back and doing 2D graphic adventures or whatever just seemed like I'd be going backwards.
I understand, yeah.
So that's where I was hoping, and got to do that a bit, and then it just kind of it became clear that it was way too much of it was hype for the technology at the time. So everything kind of died.
It sounds a bit of a bittersweet exit. Is that fair to say? It sounds.
Yeah. It was definitely bittersweet. I mean, I really wanted to continue on that project. It was like finally after 10 years or 8 years, I was on my dream project. And then it fell apart. And part of it, various things happened. One I think was, Steve Arnold, who was a huge supporter of all this, left Lucasfilm. And so we didn't have someone in upper management who was really an ally and was able to promote this and support it. So that was one of the things that happened. And no one can say, this is the future. We got to be here. We have to stay in this space. And it just kind of stopped.
Oh, fair enough. adventure titles like point-and-click adventures, easily amongst my favourite genre games. They seem to reach their peak, like huge demand around sort of mid-90s, I'd say, so early mid-90s. But then it sort of diminished very quickly in sort of late 90s, early 2000s. Why do you think these kind of classic adventure titles seem to go out of fashion? Do you have any ideas why that might have happened?
I think that the audience for them maybe didn't expand enough. But at the same time, the production values kept on getting higher and higher, which meant that the costs to do them kept on getting higher. And at least in the case of Lucas, they made a decision at some point that there wasn't enough return on their investment for, I'm sure they were selling, but they weren't selling high enough compared to, say, if they put the same numbers into, say, a Star Wars game.
Sure, yeah. Then
they can get a lot more back. And so I think it was primarily a business decision on their part, why put that much money into an adventure game, which is going to take a couple of years to finish and take all these resources, and essentially we're making an animated film by the end, when we could, and then we have a limited audience where if we could do a Star Wars movie, we have a much broader audience and we could sell a lot more. So it was all, very driven by commercial success. And this is kind of speculation because I wasn't there at the time.
Yeah.
But from piecing some things together, I think that might be part of it. I think Ron wanting to do an adventure game in the style of the old games, like for Thimbleweed Park.
Oh yeah.
Was brilliant because that meant that we could go back to production values that we had in the late 80s, early 90s, and we knew more or less what those budgets would be, and we could come up with a game which didn't have to be full screen animated sequences or 3D in order to produce and kind of set expectations by the type of game we were creating. About how much of it should be there in the game.
Well, actually, yeah, it's a good time to talk about Thimbleweed Park, if that's okay. Because I'm halfway through the game right now. I haven't finished it, but I'm really, really enjoying it. And I think it's been so successful. And it obviously shows there's still a huge demand for these sort of classic style adventure titles. But how did you get the opportunity to work on it? Did Ron call you up one day? Did it come out of the blue? What actually happened?
Yeah, well, Ron's another person I've stayed in touch with over the years. Not as much as Noah, because Noah lives close by and Ron usually lives far away. But I think we reconnected more solidly. Sorry, let me say that again.
Yeah.
We reconnected more solidly when I was working on my RubeWorks game, Rube Goldberg game.
Oh yeah.
And I had both Ron and Noah over several times to brainstorm with me on the game and how we should proceed, and different ways I could take these cartoons that Rube Goldberg did back in the 1930s and adapt them into a game that would be fun to play. And so with those multiple times and then showing them progress on the game, we kind of reconnected in that level. And I think there was a couple of times when Ron was doing some mobile games where he'd have me to be a play tester, where we sit down and he'd watch me play the game for an hour and kind of talk about what I was experiencing and just watching, what my confusions were. So we kind of traded back and forth a few times and things like that. And he told me that he and Gary were going to do this project. He was kind of waffling about whether we should do it. And, I was giving him some support because I thought it'd be a really fun thing to happen. And I ended up, I think, reviewing some of their Kickstarter screens and pages and, helping him with editing the text and making a few suggestions. And I told him, I said, hey, if this actually happens, I would love to be a part of it.
Yeah.
So it really he couldn't promise anything at the time, obviously, because he didn't know how successful the fundraising would be. But at some point when they reached their target, pretty fast, he announced that both myself and Mark Ferrari would be on the project. And, that was pretty exciting. When we had our first brainstorming meetings, he and Gary and I, they had already, very much like Maniac Mansion, they had the overall story, they had the characters, they knew more or less what the arc would be, what the rooms would be.
Yep.
But the puzzles weren't really defined completely. Some of them were, some weren't. So the brainstorming was really to take it from that level down to the very specific, where do you find each thing in each room? What are the beats we need in the game, the story beats, and what's motivating some of these characters, and I think we had maybe 4 or 5 days of brainstorming over a 2 or 3 month period. So we do usually 1 or 2 days at a time. We would be in the same room first doing that. And then, when he got his engine far enough along and Gary had started doing some of the wireframe art, I was brought on to start wiring up all the rooms, and so we could actually walk through them and kind of feel like what was happening. We could actually do a version of a game that was playable.
Fair play. Was it?
Yeah.
I know you kept your toe in the water regarding making video games, but was it weird getting back into that old sort of classic point-and-click adventures? Did it feel quite natural, or did it take a little while to get back into it again? Or
well, there was a period where I kind of was outside of gaming. I think from around maybe 95. For 5 years, I was not really doing games. I did a location-based entertainment project for a year in 2000, and then again I went away from it, and then I did another project as a consultant for Disney on a location-based project for a year, and went away. So I was kind of off and on, and I really was outside the industry, really until I did Rootworks, and that was really the first game where I had fully involved in doing games again. And then when Ron invited me on the project, and I said, yeah, I could do it. Then, internally I'm thinking, well, can we go back? Can we get back to that same level of creativity? Do I still have it? Can I still brainstorm like with these guys? And can we make it fun? And, I think it wasn't, I was stressed a bit, but not too much. And definitely not enough to ever say, no, I don't know if I can do this. It was more like internal thoughts. But after our first brainstorming, the first 5 minutes, I'd say, of our brainstorming session, it was like, okay, no problem. We can do this. And everything just felt like we just gone right back into the mode that we had 25 years earlier, and felt very comfortable and fell into a really nice rhythm, and you could see, how this is going to work, and it was really fun. I loved working with both of them, and then as the team expanded, when Jen came on, she was involved in some of the brainstorming sessions too, and the team that Ron put together was amazing. It was a different experience, since our meetings were usually either over Skype, or we ended up using Slack, and that's where we have all the text chats or audio chats or whatever was through Slack. And then, even though our team is spread around the globe, it still felt pretty cohesive. There's probably someone working on the game at some time during the day, every day, 24 hours around the clock, because of how spread out everyone was.
Well, I personally think it's an amazing game. I'm looking forward to finishing it. I love the art style. I love the humour. It sort of captures, I think, the best bits of Monkey Island and the classic adventure titles. How proud are you of the game? And do you have a personal favourite character as well in the game, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I'm very proud of the game. Yeah. I still love tweeting about it. Every day I look at what people are saying about the game, and I congratulate people if I notice they say that they've finished it. I usually congratulate them and talk to them a bit on Twitter.
Yep.
Favorite characters, probably, either Ransom or Dolores for totally different reasons. I wrote the way we did the game. Most of the dialogue sequences were done. Some were done by Ron. I think I did one early on and just realized how hard these were to do. That it was going to be really hard for me to do it. So we ended up getting Lauren to be our writer. And so she wrote a lot of those, and Ron wrote a bunch of those. So I didn't do a whole bunch of the actual dialogue puzzles or sequences, but I did a lot of the cutscene dialogues along with Ron, and most of the the kind of the little things that happen dialogue, with as the characters go around the puzzles, like wiring up the environment.
Yeah.
Except for the hotel and the sewers, which were done by Jen. So, I ended up writing a lot of Dolores dialogue and text and Ransom stuff after we kind of got the mode, after Ron kind of set the tone for both. And Dolores just felt, I could easily remember what it was like to want to work at Lucasfilm and get hired there. So a lot of that comes directly from my experience of what that felt like, and that yearning and wanting to be part of that company, and then twisting it to make it funny and kind of parodying it as Lucasfilm.
It's very clever.
Yeah, it was actually something that we called the company internally back at the time.
Oh, really?
So that was we kind of would make fun of it ourselves while we were there. So.
That's a good in-joke.
Yeah. Ransom, I ended up, I think it's probably pretty well known. We ended up recording, when we wrote the dialogue for Ransom, we wrote it as beeps. So, I don't want a beeping do that, what the beep. And we tried recording, having the actor who did Ransom record it, try to do some tests by saying beep.
Yeah.
And it just felt really flat. So Ron had him ad-lib, real swear words, swearing without the words there's beep. Then it was my task to take those 700 or 600 lines of audio. Yeah. And go through and actually add beeps to them. So I got to hear him, doing it raw, and then adding the, it was kind of mind-numbing task. I think it took me a couple of weeks to go through it.
The amount of swear words, eh?
Yeah, there's a lot. Some lines had 4 or 5 of them. Wow. So, but we saved those, and I think it's already known that we plan to release downloadable content.
Oh, like an 18 version is what you're thinking.
So I think that's it's coming at some point.
Oh, wow. I can't wait.
That's public knowledge.
Oh, fair enough. I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think there will be a sequel possibly to Thimbleweed Park by any chance? Or?
I don't know. I think we're still in that mode where not as much me, because I pretty much been off the project, maybe part-time during the summer, and then pretty much off since September.
Yeah.
Ron is still much more involved, and I think he's just coming off. And when you're focused so tightly on a project, you really want some downtime before it's kind of like you don't want to bounce into the next thing before you're ready to really choose what you want to do next. So I would guess it's not likely there'll be a sequel specifically on Thimbleweed Park. I'm sure Ron will do other games.
Yeah.
Whether or not I get to work with him again, it kind of depends on what kind of game he does and whether he needs an adventure game guy on it. But yeah, I'd love to work again if that happened. He knows that. But we'll have to see. It was a lot of fun. I don't know enough about the finances of the game to know whether it was profitable enough to justify doing another game in that same genre.
Yeah. Well, I hope it does happen personally, but that's,
Yeah, well, I know it broke even. I know that that they made money, but there's a difference between making enough money to fund another game versus making enough money to pay the rent and survive and do what you need to do. And I don't know where we are with that. That's I'm not involved in that level of the game.
Fair enough. No, I hope it does happen though. A couple of really cheeky questions, and I don't think you can tell me them, but did Ron Gilbert ever reveal to you the secret of Monkey Island? And do you think he'll ever get the opportunity to work on his personal third Monkey Island game? I know you probably can't answer these, but I'll chuck it out anyway.
Sure. Well, first question, no. I kind of know it, but he hasn't actually told me it.
Yep.
The likelihood of him getting to do a third, I think, is pretty tiny for the same reason that probably even more so than the likelihood of me getting to do a Zak. In the case of Zak, I would probably be willing to do a game that was owned by Disney.
Yep.
If it was under the right circumstances and there was enough buffering so I didn't have to deal with a lot of bullshit.
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
But in the case of Ron, I know that he would not want to do a game that he didn't own. And so the idea of licensing something that he created from Disney and then having Disney essentially have last say on what he could or couldn't do, it would just, I think that's a no-go. There's no way that would happen. And whether Disney would actually say, yes, go ahead, here you can buy this free and clear. It's hard to see getting them in the room with someone without millions and millions of dollars, on the table to do something like that. I mean, they just wouldn't bother since their focus is somewhere else. It's kind of like not even picking up the phone kind of thing.
It's a big shame, isn't it? But I hear what you're saying completely.
Yeah, and this is just kind of mostly my speculation based on. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, there could be some deal that's happening in the back room somewhere where that totally could happen.
Yeah.
But I think it's not likely.
You wouldn't put money on it there. Fair enough.
Yeah, I wouldn't put any money on that. Not my money.
No, of course. Before we finish, really couple of quick questions then. Is there any projects or other games you're working on, or any future projects you hope to get involved in that you can tell us?
Well, I'm not working on anything quite yet. I'm finishing up a few updates to like the Rube Goldberg game, to RubeWorks, and to some earlier apps I did with my wife.
Yep.
There's another storybook that she'd written for kids that I had started to do as a storybook app. Not really a game, but for younger kids, several years ago that I'd like to go back and finish. And I would, still love to get involved in a location-based entertainment type project, maybe an AR project. I mean, I think the idea of going into a theme park where you have an amazing environment already built physically, and then doing AR on top of it as an overlay, and having overlay games is going to be a huge activity you do at those parks. And there's Jonathan Ackley, who was at LucasArts, and I worked together with him at Rocket Science Games. So he ended up at Disney as a Disney Imagineering, and that's what he brought to them, as trying to do interactive as overlay games on the parks. The project that Annie and I got to work on was under Jonathan, when he wanted to do overlay stuff at a few of the Asia parks. And we got to do one at Tokyo Disney Sea, which actually got implemented, called the Leonardo Challenge. Yeah. And you could Google that and see some imagery from it. And that's still kind of a dream for me. So whether it's AR, whether it's just actually being in a park, whether it's a VR thing or some combination of those, I don't know yet, but I would still love to do that.
I generally hope that happens. I really think you'd be the right man for the job.
Yeah, me too. We're going back to. I'm a Harry Potter fan too. Yep. I went to the park in Orlando, and then the one in Los Angeles a couple of times. And my wife and I are going back to the Orlando one in February because she hasn't seen that one because there's a lot more there. But
yep.
But the idea of having some Harry Potter spectacles on where you could walk through with a wand that's interactive and do stuff and interact with other people and wizards and where you have this amazing locale that really feels like you're in that universe. It would be a really fun game to do.
That sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah. So I'm sure things like that will happen. I don't know if I'll be on them or not, but I'm sure maybe I'll at least get to play them if I don't get to do it myself.
Really wish you all the good luck. Just before we say goodbye, final question. If you could share a few drinks with a video game character, who would you choose and why?
Ooh. Well, I'm thinking of would I want to drink with Ransom? I don't think I could survive his tongue lashing. So probably not him. It'd probably be too damaging to my ego to hang out with him.
Yeah.
I probably would want to hang out with Zak.
Yeah.
And just because he has clearly some similar interests to mine. I'd like to hear some stories about what he's up to, what crazy, wacky things he's uncovered, conspiracies and alien invasions and things like that, and just kind of find out what he's been doing for the last, Well, the game took place, 1997, I think? We did it earlier. So I guess I have to find out what he's been doing for the last 20 years.
That sounds like the perfect answer, actually. I like that. Very good.
Okay.
That generally really, really means a lot to me that you came on today. And I know our listeners are going to love this interview, so really, really appreciate the time. I wish you all the luck in the future. You're on Twitter, aren't you, Dave? So people can follow you, can't they, there?
Yeah, follow me at David B. as in boy, Fox, David B. Fox on Twitter, and that's probably where I'm most active. I'm on Facebook too, but not as active there.
And have you got a website as well? Is that what you do?
Electric Eggplant.
Yeah.
As our little company, and you can go there and also contact me there through that and find out what we're working on.
Brilliant. I really do. Urge our listeners to do that. But thanks so much, David. Do appreciate it, and all the best luck in the future. And I really hope your theme park idea really comes to fruition. Definitely.
That's great. I'm sure I'll get to play it someday.
Yeah, definitely.
Even if it's not my creation, someone is doing this.
Good on you. All right. Well, David, I'll leave it there because I know you're a busy man. So I'll talk to you another time. Hopefully. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
See you later. Bye bye.